Good afternoon, Spartans. Welcome to this week's Professional Series webcast, brought to you every second and fourth Thursday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time by the MSU Alumni Association. My name is Dave Isbell, and I'm the Assistant Director of Alumni Professional Enrichment, and I'm happy to have you here as our guest for today's presentation, Your Time Perspective as a Key to Well-Being. Our presenter today is Tammison Smith. Tammison came to Michigan State University, where she's the Career Advising and Training Coordinator for the Career Services Network, following the yellow brick road from Kansas. At MSU, she trains and supervises graduate students as they advise students on career issues. Along the way, she stopped at Grand Valley State University and Davenport University in Grand Rapids. Tammison received her master's in counseling psychology from Avila University and worked on her doctorate in counseling psychology at the University of Kansas. Currently, she enjoys volunteering to teach disaster psychology for community engagement response teams in her area, working as part of a therapy dog team with her poodle Osage, and advocating for rare disease awareness. Before I hand over the floor to Tammison, I'd like to point out the chat on the left side of your screen. Feel free to ask questions during the chat, during the presentation, and I'll make sure Tammison addresses them. Also, this presentation is being recorded. You'll be able to find this recording and all of our past recordings at www.spartanshelpingspartans. With that, I'll hand over the keys to Tammison. Thanks for being here with us today, Tammison.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay.
I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, good. So, good afternoon. Welcome to this presentation. All right, I'm going to start with the first slide here that has a few quotes about time. Just pointing out that time has been something that we've been interested in probably as long as we've been thinking about this. So if you look at the first few quotes here that are from Shakespeare, kind of pointing out how we've been impacted by time. They're sort of pointing out that wasting time, and then how time then wastes us. Going all the way to the last slide, or to the last quote, which is actually from a modern movie that sort of points out a more positive viewpoint, that the bad news is that time flies, but the good news is that you're actually the pilot. So you're actually in control of how you use your time. So just sort of some various quotes about time over the years, but it just shows that time is something that we've been interested in, and how we perceive time just over the years. So when we think about time, time is probably one of the most valuable, if not arguably the most valuable asset that we have. But in reality, it's the asset that we probably pay the least or maybe no attention to in terms of how we spend it. You know, we often spend more attention to how we spend our money, or other assets in that regard. If somebody asked us to invest our money, we'd really consider how we're spending that or how we're investing that. But if someone asked us, if someone we weren't particularly fond of or didn't like asked us to spend the evening to go to dinner with them, we'd do it. But we wouldn't necessarily think about how we're investing that time. But if that same person asked us to invest our money, we'd investigate and figure it out before we did that. So often we spend little or no attention to how we spend our time and how we invest our time. But there definitely is a cost to how we choose to invest or not invest our time. For example, if we're a job seeker and there's a networking event in a neighboring town, there is a cost to going to that networking event. There's a cost to having to travel. But if we choose not to go to that event, there's a cost to not going because we might not make a connection that could lead to a job. So there's a cost to missing an opportunity, just as there's a cost to investing the time. But we often don't think about what the cost is to how we opt to spend our time. But the reality is that we are finite, our time is finite, and so knowing how and why we choose to spend our most precious resource can help us balance our investment, and help us to choose how we how we balance to spend our time, and how we manage the costs of how we choose to spend our time. And that's as we all struggle with, how we're choosing to balance our work life investment that we have, and this struggle that we are finding ourselves in with work-life balance, understanding why and our perspective of time can be very valuable. So time perspective really came from Philip Zimbardo. He's a past president of the American Psychological Association, and he's a retired Stanford professor. And he was looking for a yardstick to understand attitudes and beliefs and values that people hold about time. And so he studied and identified different ways that we view time, and he termed these time perspectives, or what throughout this I'm going to call TP. Just we don't have to keep saying the word time perspective. So he called them TP. And for TP, the concept behind a time perspective, or a TP, is that what happened in our past and what we believe is going to happen in the future can impact our present so much that we actually allow what happened in our past and what we think is going to happen in the future to define the present. And so then we behave accordingly. So for example, if a woman has had a number of bad relationships, and the current relationship that she's in seems to be following that pattern, she's getting a sense that it's going to follow that pattern. So in other words, her past has had a pattern, and she's getting the sense, she believes that her future is going to follow that pattern. She's letting that define her present, and she behaves accordingly. She gets out of the relationship. So her past has been one way, her future seems to be going that way, so she defines her present in that way and she behaves accordingly. So Zimbardo would say that's a time perspective, that's a TP. Now, most often, our time perspective, it's out of conscious awareness. We're not aware that we have this time perspective. It's not something we sit around and think about. It's not something we talk about. It's just something that we function out of. And it does indeed influence almost everything we do. So Robert Levine actually studied what he was calling pace of life, or how fast people do things, like how fast they walked, how fast they talked, how fast they worked. So doing things like in a post office selling stamps, or in a bank doing banking types of activities. And he studied this in 36 American cities to find out how fast the pace of life was in these 36 American cities. And he ranked them. He actually did this all over the world, but in particularly in 36 American cities, to find out how fast the pace of life was in these 36 American cities. And then he looked at these 36 American cities at how willing they were to help a stranger who maybe had a brace on his or her leg and had dropped something, or had dropped a stamped envelope that hadn't been mailed, or had dropped a pin and was unaware of it. So how willing they were to help a stranger. And found that those cities that had a faster pace of life were less willing to help a stranger. So what we're finding is that even though our time perspective seems to be out of our conscious awareness, it does seem to influence everything we do, from things like engaging and helping behaviors to things like drinking and driving, health screenings, things like this. So our time perspectives, they're out of our conscious awareness, yet they influence everything that we do on our day-to-day behaviors. So these time perspectives seem to be a key to understanding our behavior, and it does seem to be a key to modifying and fully engaging in life. Again, balancing those costs of how we're spending our time, and really balancing our life. So for Philip Zimbardo, make sure I get my So for Philip Zimbardo, his quote would be, "Somewhere between ordering the past and anticipating the future lies our day-to-day realities." That's how he sees a time perspective. So his research identified 6 time perspectives, and really define those as a past, a present, or a future perspective. And then they tend to have either a negative or a positive spin. So you can have a positive spin or a negative spin on the past, a positive or a negative spin on the present, and the same thing with the future. Again, these tend to give order and meaning to your past, present, or future life events. They tend to encode past events and give them a positive or negative meaning to them. And they tend to set expectations and goals, and as well as help us sort of imagine outcomes for the actions that we choose. So again, such as if we go back to the example with a woman in her relationship, she had expectations and goals for what was going to happen with that relationship, helped her imagine the outcomes that she thought was going to happen based on what she had experienced in the past and what she felt she was experiencing in the present. So that's what her perspective did. Now we tend to have one time perspective that's a preferred functional style, just from what we have experienced. And because we're constantly functioning from this preferred style, we tend to have a bias for that one over all of the others because we're constantly functioning out of that one. Now, ideally, research has shown we would function from all of them, from the past, present, and future, but we do tend to have a bias for one of them. Now, because we have a bias for one of them, again, that can influence our behavioral choices, such as healthy eating, risk-taking, spending time with friends, that type of thing. Now, we're going to go through each of these perspectives and see if one makes more sense for you. If you feel like, yep, this is one that makes sense for me, I tend to function out of this one. At the end, I'm going to let you know where you can go online and actually take the Zimbardo time perspective inventory, and you can get a sense for, yep, this is the one that I function out of. As we go through these, we'll talk about the positive and negatives of each of these and actually give you sort of brief things that you can do to sort of help you function more positively from each of these perspectives. So as you remember, I said that they tend to have both a positive and negative spin. So for the past positive, these are folks who tend to see the past in a very glowing and positive construction of the past. They tend to be sentimental. They tend to be very strong traditionalists, and they see the present and the future through the positive lens of the past. They're nostalgic for the good old days. They tend to associate highly with positive self-esteem. They tend to be low on depression and anxiety measures, and there generally tends to be a general prediction of good, healthy outlook on life with folks who score high on this measure. Past negative, these folks tend to have a pessimistic or negative or aversive attitude about the past. When they see the past, they see it through a negative lens of the past. Mentally and emotionally, they may be stuck in a painful recollection of the past, and they tend to be associated with higher measures of depression, higher measures of aggression, anxiety, and higher measures of escape behavior, such as drinking, gambling. Again, if you think about this, they're stuck in painful recollections of mental and emotional past. So again, they would be perhaps trying to escape those types of things. So what's good and bad about past perspectives? Well, a positive past can build a strong base to a positive future. So when we look at folks who are, for example, recovering from addiction, research has shown that those who are recovering from addiction, if they have a structured pattern to their past, so if they have a past that has a very strong sort of structure to it, so yesterday, these are the things I did, they tend to show a better addiction recovery, because when yesterday there wasn't anything going on, and again, yesterday had painful painful memories because there wasn't anything going on. I just was sitting around remembering the bad things and I didn't have a structure to it, then they tend to return back to those drug addiction ways. But when yesterday there was a structure to it and I was doing positive things, they tend to show better addiction recovery. For college students, those college students that have higher goal setting tend to do that because they have more positive past view on goal setting. I'm setting goals because this is what happens when I set goals. I've set goals in the past, and this is what happens when I set goals. When we work with students, in particular in careers when we're working with students, but anyone, those who know more about their past, especially their family's past, we know that those who are trying to build a life story, for those who are trying to build a life story, those who know more about their family's past tend to have more of their own story to build upon. So those who know, this is what my parents did, this is how they met, these were their dreams and their goals, they have more of their own life story to build upon because they have more of their own past to know. So it's Mark Savickas, who's a career theorist, will say those who have a bigger book of a past have a bigger book to write in because they have a bigger book to write, have a bigger life, a bigger book, a bigger family history. They can write their history in a bigger book. It's like having like a family Bible. Well, if you have a family Bible, you've got a bigger book to write in. Now, some of the bad, well, if you're stuck in a negative past, that can certainly mar your present and your future. So again, go back to the example of the woman who's had previous bad relationships. Right, if you've had previous bad relationships, it may color future relationships because you're always looking for that bad, right? So everyone's past tends to be a mixture of good and bad events. So how is it that some people can survive horrific pasts without necessarily focusing on those past negative events and becoming past negative focus? So how is that? Well, one of the ways is it really is your attitude toward events in your past that matter more than the events themselves. So we've all met someone who's had a really tragic event, maybe the death of a loved one or their own illness, and yet they don't seem to have a negative focus on that event. It's been a negative event, but they don't have a negative focus on it. It's because it's their attitude toward the event that matters more than the event itself. You can't change the event, but you can change your attitude toward the event. And it's really the attitude that matters more than the event. And that's how you change that past perspective. So there's some simple activities that you can try to break or lessen the past negative hold. I think if anybody's been out on Facebook, you've probably done this yourself, or you've seen other people that have tried this thankfulness challenge on Facebook, right? And you've seen people are supposed to spend 30 days listing maybe 3, 4, or 5 things every day that you're thankful for. Well, research has actually shown that this simple act of just counting your blessings, and counting your blessings, so to speak, can actually get you focusing on them. Remember, I said it's a matter of changing your attitude about things. So changing that attitude, getting focused on what you're thankful for, seeing them, finding them, being aware of what you're thankful for. It isn't necessarily actually going to change what's going on. It's not going to change the actual event. It's not going to change your situation. But what it's doing is changing your awareness of this, changing your attitude about them. We've seen with research, for example, with patients who have neuromuscular diseases, that while their neuromuscular disease isn't going away, their symptoms aren't going away, but having them do something like the thankfulness challenge and having them write down the things that they're grateful for can actually lessen their symptoms or lessen their awareness of their symptoms. Something else that you can try is the Who Was I challenge. So it's 20 questions of having you go through and say, who was I? Trying asking yourself 20 times to say, who was I? And looking at who was I in the past. And you may not have 20 answers necessarily, but the challenge is to try to think of who you were in the past. 20 times and just write down 20 times who was I, and going back and looking at who I was, and they may not all be good, and that's okay, but who was I 20 times in the past. And you can do this actually before. If you want to try the thankfulness challenge, try it before you do the thankfulness challenge, and then come back after the thankfulness challenge and try it again and see if your perception of who you were has at all changed and become more positive. Because again, hopefully that thankfulness challenge has gotten you to see things in a more positive light. Another thing that you can try is the 3 significant negative events. So being able to find 3 significant negative events from your past, and then looking for 3 positive messages. So the idea here is, what are 3 significant negative events from your past? And then what are 3 positive messages that came from that? So perhaps it was a negative event, but now it's something that, I'm not going to repeat that mistake. I've seen it, I've done it, I'm not going to do it again. Or I learned to be stronger from that. Or it brought my family closer together from that event. And then how can you improve your future from each of those negative events? So you cannot change the event. You're not dismissing the event. You're not lessening the significance of that event on yourself or from those around you. But what you are saying is, this is what I learned from it, this is what I gained from it, and this is how I'm going to improve my future from what happened. So again, it's realizing that your past perspective can have a positive spin or it can have a negative spin, and it's trying to move or to lessen the negative role of your past event and increase your positive in it. All right, now we'll look at the present perspective. So in the present perspectives, there are actually 3 of the present perspectives. The first one is the hedonistic. Now, for these folks, what is current and in the immediate is what is most significant for them. So they actually actively seek pleasure. They're really into the short-term payoffs, what's immediate, and they really want to avoid kind of high-effort, boring situations. They like to focus on what is rather than what will be or what was. They tend to give in easily to temptation. They can be distracted from task performance. They tend not to be influenced by persuasive messages about what they should be doing, or what's going to be happening. This tends to be associated with things like poor ego control or with novelty and sensation seeking. Present fatalistic, which is what's under the phrase present perspective. For these folks, there really is sort of an absence of any kind of focused time perspective, because for them the future is predetermined. And they feel that what they do, their own actions, cannot influence the future, and that basically humans are at the mercy of fate, and that the presence is something you just tolerate. So often they're associated with, they have high levels of anxiety and of depression, and they really don't sort of think about future consequences because they feel that the future is out of their own hands. Sort of on the farthest of this is what we call the present holistic. So this one may be the most difficult to understand because in Western culture we don't look at this a lot, but present holistic contains both present and future time orientation. In meditation, this is what we call mindfulness. But trying to live as though both future and present exist within the present, or I'm sorry, both future and past exist within the present. I think this quote perhaps understates it best, in that it's sort of giving up the longing for the future and regretting the past, but living fully in the present, as if both the past and the future are part of who you are, but they don't distract you from existing and experiencing the moment. So it's living fully in the present. I think mindfulness is maybe the phrase that we've heard the most. So for in Zimbardo's terms, probably the most balanced would be the present is holistic. Really being possible to live in the moment instead of being lost in the past, or being concerned with the future, to the point that you sort of lose being present in the moment fully. But being able to relax and live, connect with people, really experiencing things as they happen. And when we do that, we get to engage in the process. Right? We're not so concerned over the product, over what we're creating and what the outcome's going to be, but we can really engage in the process. And one of the things we learn when we can engage in the process is that we actually become more creative and we become more innovative. And this was actually identified by a psychologist named Mihail Csikszentmihalyi, and he identified something called flow. And we've all probably experienced this, even if we didn't know there was a term for it, when we really get into something we're doing and we're really in the moment, and we'll know this, we know when we're really into something. It's that feeling of losing track of time, right? You're so into a task that you're doing. Again, you're not concerned about the outcome of the task. You're not concerned, what's this going to be like when it's done? You're just in it and you're doing it and you're just enjoying it. And again, you lose track of time. You sort of lose awareness of yourself in the process. You're just into the process of creating something or doing something or making something. You're very rewarded by what you're doing. You're very focused, and everything else seems to fall away except for what you're experiencing. And that is probably that true sense of the holistic time, that holistic TP. But Csikszentmihalyi identified that as flow. But being able to do that and being able to exist in that would be very balanced if we could do that. That would be a great thing. And we know that when you can do that, there's been research that when we can do that, we become very creative and very innovative. When we can sort of give up the, how are people going to judge what I've created here? Is this going to be what it needs to be? We can become very creative and innovative. Clearly, the hedonistic and the fatalistic time perspectives can be problematic. Obviously, when we feel we're not in control, that the future is predetermined, those can obviously be problematic. Obviously, the hedonistic, living in the moment, not being concerned about what giving up, not being concerned about what I'm doing to myself in the future, those can be problematic. In fact, research shows that those with the strong hedonistic time perspective show little concern for drinking and driving, for smoking. They don't wear seat belts. They're less likely to get health screenings, to use condoms, those types of things. So those are obviously problematic with those outlooks, those time perspectives. Simple things that you can do to sort of improve the holistic awareness, because it's great when we can get into the flow when we're working on things. It's great when we can have more of that experience of those kind of things. Practices like meditation, yoga. I think Dave had mentioned in the bio that I do therapy dog, and so one of the things to become a therapy dog team had to do a lot of dog training. And if you've ever worked with dogs, if you've ever trained dogs, they are creatures who live in the moment. So if you're going to train a dog, you gotta live in the moment with your dog. So that's been one of my favorite ways of learning to live in the moment. It's been training my dog. So any way that you can learn to connect, to live in the moment, those are great things. But some exercises that you can try. Who am I? Trying to answer this as many times as you can. Who am I? Um, when am I? So that's more than just time and date, but when am I in my relationships? When am I in my spiritual development? When am I in my parenting skills? Where am I? Again, more than just place. Where am I? Or how do I feel? And how do I feel as in right now? So all of these questions, and it's your challenge to try and answer them in as many ways and to reach as far as you can when you answer them. Not just the obvious ones, but to reach as far as you can. Because the goal of these are to connect you to the here and now, to who you are here and now. Again, to get you connected with that holistic, not to the past, not to the future, realizing that all of those are part of who you are, but to connect you with who you are in the here and now. All right, and then the future perspective. There's actually only one of these. Again, for Zimbardo, this is probably overall the most balanced perspective. The future perspective, the focus is on planning for and achievement of future goals. For individuals with future perspective, they see the value in delaying current wants to achieve future opportunities. This is a perspective, this is not a perspective that we're born with. This isn't something that small children have. This is something that develops, and for cultures that that have education and value education. It's something that comes with more education. It's something that comes with more maturity, and it's something that comes with more responsibility. It is something that also comes with societal, familial, and cultural stability. So often we find that societies that have less stability, this can be a difficult one to have. If your society is war-torn, this is a difficult time perspective to embrace if you're part of a war-torn society. Also employment. If you suffer from long-term unemployment, this can be a difficult perspective to embrace. So employment, stability, both societal, cultural, and familial are important to help embrace this. It is associated with things like conscientiousness, consideration of future consequences, and there is there's very little correlation with novelty seeking, and it's only weakly correlated with things like anxiety and depression. Because obviously when you're considering future consequences of your actions and you're thinking, should I go buy this or should I put this money in the bank? And you're thinking about what your future consequences are, you're going to make different choices than if you're only living in the here and now. All right, so what are the good and bads of this perspective? Well, folks with this perspective, they tend to care about things like health and mortality, so they tend to take the long picture about the future. They do tend to be good at things like goals. They're good at planning, which is obviously very good for things like work achievement, school achievement, because they're good at planning out their semester. They're good at planning out projects and things like that. They also tend to be better at managing money because they're taking the long view. They're better at planning and goal setting when it comes to money. This also tends to make folks with this perspective better at problem solving. Again, anytime you're better at setting goals, better at planning, better at willing to take the long view, you tend to be better at solving problems. They also do tend to be more hopeful in the face of adversity. If you're willing to look at a problem and see that the solution may not be right around the corner, but it may be longer down the road. You may have to not only set short-term goals, but long-term goals. And you may have to not only make one plan, but multiple plans and work around obstacles. Then they can tend to be more hopeful in the face of adversity. However, there can be bad things about having this perspective as well. Sometimes when you're willing to take the really long picture, you do sacrifice the present picture, just as we were talking about with the present, being present holistic. Sometimes you do sacrifice the present for those long-term futures. So, saving all of today's income for the future can be a problem, because sometimes then you miss that great movie next week, or that fantastic toy your child wants for his birthday, because you're trying to save for the college or whatever. So sometimes you miss today, always saving for tomorrow, or sometimes you're working those 60, 70-hour weeks and you miss what's right in front of you. So sometimes it can be a problem, always, always, always looking for the future, and you do miss what's happening right in front of you. So some simple exercises trying to improve maybe future time perspective. Things such as I will be. So again, as many answers as you can. Things that you're hoping that will happen, things that you're hoping that will be, and that you can become. And these, again, can be anything that you want them to be, can be as many things as you want them to be. And then from there, concrete future goals, and typically no more than 5 goals that are going to lead you toward one of the I will be's. So whichever one you want to picking one of those I will be's, and then 5 goals that are going to help you toward that. And it can be, I'm going to get a new job, I'm going to finish my degree, I'm going to sell my house, whatever it is. But it's 5 concrete future goals that are going to lead you toward one of the I will be's. And then from there, when will the goal be accomplished? And again, focusing on the process, not on the product. So, when will that goal be accomplished? So whenever it is that that you find, whatever the timeline for accomplishing that concrete future goal, so you've got your 5 concrete future goals, when will that be accomplished? Working backwards toward that I will be. The next one is mental simulation, or what we call structured daydreaming. So first, starting with a goal, and then what is one step you can accomplish tomorrow toward that ID goal? And then what is one step you can accomplish next week? So if you're going to choose getting a new job, then maybe one step you can accomplish tomorrow is identifying 2 places that you can look for a new job. And then one step you can accomplish next week is applying for 2 jobs. And then each day you're going to accomplish, or each day you're going to identify one step you can take further out. So you're going to identify a goal you can accomplish tomorrow, a goal you can accomplish next week, a goal you can accomplish in 2 weeks, and you're pushing yourself to keep identifying a little further out and a little further out and a little further out until you've accomplished your goal. So again, it's about the process. It's not about the product. It's about the process, and you're imagining your process. So, but you're pushing yourself to see and to imagine. Remember, it's structured daydreaming, and you're pushing yourself to see yourself accomplishing that in these steps, and they're bigger and bigger, broader steps, and that's really the goal that you're pushing yourself to do. All right, a little bit about time here in terms of generations, because we are finding some interesting things in terms of how this is, how the generations are fitting into these time perspectives. And what we are finding is that younger age groups under 30 are showing a strong preference for the time perspective of present hedonistic. And what we haven't figured out yet is whether that tends to be a result of maturation, because remember we said future orientation is something that you learn. It's something that develops. So we're not sure yet if that's because the personality trait hasn't set in, it hasn't matured yet, but we do know that having that strong trait or that strong preference for present hedonistic does put them at risk for academic goal orientation tasks, because that really requires that future orientation. It also puts them at higher risk for behaviors with long-term negative consequences, such as drinking and driving, skipping health screenings, things like that. So we get that under 30 age group that tend to have all of these risk factors because they're not looking further ahead and they're not looking further out for what's going to put them at risk. All right, if you're interested, this is Zimbardo's website. It's called thetimeparadox.com, and you can do his time preference inventory, and you can find out which one of these six. And he also has one more in there that tends to be a sort of a life after death perspective, which is a different type of perspective. But you can find out which one of these tends to be more of your preference, and maybe learn some other perspective, some other ideas as well. So I'm not sure if we've had any questions or any thoughts.
Looks like Tammison, everyone's being shy and quiet in this group. So
I know they're processing all of this.
yes. So there's a couple of statements that I put in there in the chat that were really kind of struck me as you're going, and I've heard them before, but for some reason they just stood out to me. So the attitude matters more than the event itself, and I think that could be really kind of harrowing to hear when somebody's in the stages of grief, or it's really difficult because they just had a loss or something like that. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think in the time perspective concept, what he's saying is that again, we all do face, awful things can happen and bad things do happen in our lives, but what makes the difference between someone having a past positive perspective and a past negative perspective is certainly not the events that happen. It's how we choose to look at them. And so it's trying to find what we can learn from them and what we can learn from them and what we can take from them, and how we can move forward from them. And so what that again, it isn't trying to say that something didn't happen or that something isn't important or to make less of it or make light of it. The event is always a traumatic thing and it's always an awful thing. And that is always true. But then what you choose to do with it is what's going to make the difference, because otherwise you are going to be stuck in that past negative. And as the time perspective says, that past is going to influence your present, and that present is going to color your future. So it's you have to then make that choice about what am I going to do with my attitude. And he uses the analogy of that great rivers can be moved by just shifting a bank. And so you have to think in a way of your attitude as being the bank of your river of time. And so if you can shift the bank of your attitude to say, all right, this was a horrible thing that happened to me, but if I choose to shift my attitude, I can literally move the river of my time, and I can choose to change my present, and I can choose to change my future.
Good thoughts. I want to pull out one more thing that I had made, and then Stephanie and Jay have a good conversation going on. I wanted to have you read that and kind of give your thoughts on what they're talking about. So you had talked about kind of this future orientation of making multiple future plans, and it kind of makes me think about Crumbolt's happenstance theory a little bit, about how luck is no accident. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about kind of how someone can take that perspective and use it, because it's a little bit different than like what we usually hear, like a linear goal of like step one, step two, step three, and you've achieved your goal. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Specifically about Crumbolt's?
Well, kind of like, I mean, it makes me think of Crumbolt's with, I mean, when you think about making multiple future plans instead of one linear goal that you're working toward. But since you're talking about Zimbardo, kind of think about that kind of perspective of what that means and how you apply that.
Yes. Yes, and I think that and I think Crumbolt's would always say that he would never disagree with being future oriented. I think what he would say is you have to go do. I think he would be slightly present oriented, but he would say you have to go do. And so but the point is that you have to be prepared to do. And so I think that's where the future would come in for Crumbolt's. And so what Crumbolt's would say is you have to have your resume ready. You have to be ready to network. You have to know about yourself and what you're good at. And you have to know your skills and your values and your personality. You have to know that so that you're ready to take advantage of things. So you have to be prepared. That's the point. It's the idea of planned happenstance, and that luck is no accident, and all of those things. So you have to be prepared by being ready for these chance events that come along. It's not that you just sit back and hope something happens, but that you're making events happen by being prepared, by going out and doing things, and to a certain extent that planning does happen by going and meeting people, by getting out there and doing things, and that just doesn't happen. You do have to plan for those things. You do have to go try things and do things, and that does take some planning, and you've got to be ready for the opportunities that come along. So in that regard, it may be like, for example, if you're doing the sorry, I'm looking at the last example I gave in the future about I will be, that that might be I will be these things, but what am I going to go do that's going to make that happen? So I will be this. Well, what am I prepared to go try to make that happen? And so it's, I will be these 4 things, or this is what I want to be, but what are the things I'm going to do to make that happen?
Great, thank you. So if you could take a second and read Stephanie and Jay's comments toward the bottom in the chat, and kind of just throw in your 2 cents on their discussion.
Yep, and that's one of the things. So when I actually went to our professional, so National Career Development Association conference this summer and took part of this presentation there, that was one of the things we talked about, because again, with 20-somethings, it is difficult when we're trying to get them to say, hey, you should come in and work on your resume, and they're like, yeah, I'd rather go, to the football game, or I'd rather go do something else because I don't want to think 3 years ahead. And so some of that is that structured daydreaming of getting them to think, okay, what do I want and what's the next step? So some of this may be a maturation process and they're going to have to grow into it. Yes, that is part of it. I agree with, getting them to do things like Stephanie said, about getting them to hang out with those who are older than they are, and to say, well, what did you do? That's what we call informational interviewing. That's a great idea. But again, if they're saying, well, it's not my immediate, so getting them to, we've talked about trying to sort of get them to think something's fun in the immediate and then slipping in things that they want to do. So it's like immediate fun, but it's also what they need. So there's a little bit of that. Any way that you can early on get them to start learning to delay gratification. So there is actually something called the marshmallow test where you say, if you don't eat this marshmallow, you'll get another one. So it's kind of teaching them that, hey, delayed gratification is a good thing. So anytime you can start doing that with folks early on, that's great too. So it's, again, back to that kind of teaching them. That's great. So, if you can start kind of getting them to learn the internal gratification to that, the more we can do that is good too. So, we're still struggling with that, and the more we see them, we exist in a culture where immediate gratification is everywhere. You get on the internet and you get what you want immediately. So, it's difficult, but we're trying to think of ways. We're trying to be creative and think of ways, and that's the structured daydreaming is one way that they're working with that, and they saw some great, really positive results from that. The marshmallow concept that you can apply in a lot of different ways of, if you don't do this now, you get two of that, or those kinds of things. So yeah, we're still playing with that and seeing where we can go with that. But we shared some ideas for that with the folks I was talking with. But yeah,
So
it's an interesting idea.
I'm trying to coax some 20-somethings on this cast, if there are any, to chime in about this discussion, because I think a lot of times maybe the younger folks might have a different opinion about why they are this way, or something like that. Nobody's chiming in now, but you hang out with 20-somethings all day in your office, so I'm wondering if you might,
I do.
what you're hearing from them when they talk to you about this subject.
I mean, again, a lot of it is they're very used to things just coming at them rapid fire, and they're very used to, if I want something, I mean, anything, like information. I mean, to me, it's sort of funny. If they want a piece of information, they pick up their phone and they get it. If they want food, they pick it up and get it. And so everything for them is immediate, and they get it immediately. And so if I say to them, if you want this, you'll get it in a year and a half, or it'll come, you need to spend X amount of time waiting for it. They look at me like I don't understand. So, it's something that I don't know. It is an interesting conversation that we have, because sometimes we say, okay, we're going to have this discussion, but everybody put their phones down. This is something you just have to either know or we have to talk about. But we don't get to use our phones in this discussion. That garners a lot of looks. Because they're used to everything just being right there. So I don't know. It's still something we're playing with. I think it's this is all really relatively new, this concept of time. There's next year, they just had in July the second annual time conference. So it's only been two of these. So we'll see. We'll see where the research is going.
So I was thinking as you're talking, certainly I work with 20-something in my office, and I think we have the best of the best here, because we have some awesome student employees. But I am also a parent of a couple of 20-somethings, and it's really interesting to reflect on when I was in my 20s and where they're at now. And you bring up a really good point, and so this is a generational thing, the technology issue. Because I'm sure you can resonate with being 20-something in my era too, because I think we're close to the same age. And it wasn't as fast paced. It wasn't as sometimes we had to wait for things, but we were still kind of impetuous and impulsive. At least I was. Maybe you weren't, because you're maybe better than me. But I remember. So there's some of that going back to that point of that maturation thing, and it can be a struggle. And I think I just want to be careful to not, like, ever make it seem like we're pointing fingers at an entire generation for their faults or something. Because there are great things and terrible things about each generation. So I just wanted to throw that two cents in.
Yep, and everybody has their own time preference, and there may be people in this generation who are I know some in my office who are very future oriented and who are much more future oriented than I am, by the way. And so, this is just a different way of looking at how you perceive the world around you, and that's all it is. It's a different way, and hopefully it helps you understand maybe why you make the choices that you make, because this is how you perceive. And you may not have thought about it. Often people, that's what I said, often people don't think about why they're making the choices they're making about the way they're choosing to spend their time, because we don't often think about it. And so it's just something that research has started to play with about, the differences in the generations, but not everybody in a generation looks at things the same way. I know not everybody in my generation looks at time the same way. So differences.
So Stephanie's got a couple of really good comments in there that I'd like you to kind of throw your 2 cents on. And it looks like Sonia's typing something, so that will probably be it for our time. But I want to have you address that, and then we'll close this out. But I want to leave the chat room open for those who want to continue discussing. So go ahead and get to those last few comments, Tammison, and then we'll get into the closing this up.
Yes, well, for boomers, more of their lives may be behind them than in front of them. That's true, but again, if they are very future oriented, then more power to them if that's what they see. And I guess I'm not sure what Kairos. Does that word look familiar to you, Dave?
Yeah, it looks Greek to me. Actually, literally, it looks Greek. I've heard Kairos and Chronos, and I think one is more linear and one is more kind of like maybe an eternal perspective or something. I don't know. But that's
yes. Okay, spiritual
That's probably
time.
a different perspective or
Spiritual
something
time.
than Zimbardo's.
Yes. Yep. And yes, and then we can get into all, Stephanie and I could talk about the difference between, so the other thing that we talk about is, not so much by the clock. And then the other thing would be the difference between, in cultural time, we could talk about monochronic, I can't say it, monochronic time, which is what Western cultures often function by, and polychronic time, which is often what, things like Middle Eastern time functions by, which is very different. And so there's different types of cultural time. So I know, coming from a Native American perspective, we view time a little differently than I'm used to dealing with when I'm at work. And so there's also differences in that as well. So there's many different views of time that you can take as to.
That's a really good point, Tammison. Being a thoroughbred white boy married to a Mexican woman, you'd think that the standard is that she's the one that's always late, but no, we don't always fit those cultural expectations because she's the one that's on time, and I'm the one dragging everybody in a half an hour late. So even in cultures, people have very much difference in the way that they approach things too. So. But I think that'd be a really, really good discussion for another time, the whole cultural aspect. One more thing I want to point out Sonia's question in here about more structured daydreaming. We'll give you a couple minutes to wrap that up, and then I'll wrap the presentation up. But again, I'll reiterate, I want to keep the chat room open for people to continue the conversation if they want to.
Sure. Yep. So the idea of structured daydreaming is to help you sort of expand how you are viewing, again, the process of achieving a goal. So the idea is to just, again, identify a goal and then to imagine one step you can take today, and then one step you can take next week, and then one step you can take 2 weeks from now. And the idea is to expand expand your imagination of how far you need to go to get that goal. And again, about the process, it's not about the outcome. Often when we're daydreaming, we're like, and then I imagine myself standing on the podium, or I imagine myself getting that diploma, or imagine myself getting that new job. It's not about that, but it's about tomorrow, the task that I'm going to accomplish, and this is how I'm going to do it, and it's about the process. And then next week, it's about doing this. But each time you imagine a step, it's a little bit further out in time. It's about time, and it's about going out a little bit further. So again, it's about going out a little bit further and pushing yourself to go out a little bit further in time, so that again, you're just pushing yourself out a little bit further. The website that I gave you, this last slide that's on here, if you want to, there's a video on there that's by Dr. Boyd, who is Dr. Zimbardo's partner in this research. They've got a little video on there if you want to watch a little bit about it. So there's a little video on there about it and about the research they've done about it. So there's a little bit more on there, Sonia, about that if you want to watch that too.
Okay, well that does it for our time for the actual presentation. Thank you so much, Tammison, for sharing your knowledge with us. I think this has been a fascinating presentation. I think this could spark a lot of really good discussions. So I want to invite people. We'll leave the chat room open, but I also want to invite you to join us on Twitter. We are at Helping Spartans, or the hashtag MSU Lens. If you want to find us there, we're glad to keep carrying on this discussion with you. Also, this recording can be available to you, SpartansHelpingSpartans.com. It should be up later today or tomorrow. Our next webcast will be on recruiting and retaining millennial talent. So, hey, we'll get into the millennial discussion again on Thursday, October 9th at 12:30, followed by the fourth week of October will be how to prepare for a layoff before you get laid off. That's on October 23rd. All of our upcoming webcasts can be found on our website, alumni.msu.edu, professional series. I also want to invite you to an event that we have coming up. We have a thing called Opening Doors, where we go visit companies, and this particular one I think would be interesting maybe for this group, because we're going to be at Kellogg Corporation. We're going to be talking about MSU's role in civil rights and their diversity and inclusion processes. I think it's going to be really interesting. It'll be a great event. It's on October 15th. I put the registration link right there in the chat. If you are interested in that, you can check it out. We'd love to see you there. It'll be a great time. So anyways, thank you so much. I want to remind you that we do this every second and fourth Thursday at 12:30 p.m. Standard Time and Eastern Standard. We have a lot of different topics. So if you go back to the past recorded webcast, you'll see some of those things that we have. We have some really fun stuff coming up for next year that I'm really excited about. So keep in tune with us. We'd love to chat with you again. Follow us on Twitter. Keep this conversation going, and thank you so much for being with us. Go Green.